Hello, there aliens and strangers. Welcome to the Counter Revolution podcast. I'm your host, John Rushemeza. The Counter Revolution podcast is dedicated to exploring the meaning of education, a Christian philosophy of education, and why every Christian should have an explicitly and unapologetically Christian philosophy of education. Family and friends, I have my brother, my new brother here that I'm meeting for the first time.
It's right.
John, how you say your last name?
Stamper, like a stamp you would put on a letter.
Yes,
Stamper.
okay,
Yeah.
Stamper.
Yep.
My accent is tricky, so I have to ask people because I tend to butcher things as I go. So, John Stamper, if I look at my little bio that I have here, John Stamper is an inspiring Christian author, a professional coach, and a podcast host of the State of State Schools, which I highly recommend, by the way. I've been listening to it. I've been binge listening to State of State Schools. Yeah, so in his first book, he has two books under his belt, correct?
Correct.
Yep. In his first book, Conflicted, pulling back the curtain on public education, John exposed the destructive ideology teachers are mandated to teach students in public education. His second book, Courage to Stand, is a guide for building a spiritual resilience as Christians stand against evil. John is also a physical education coach for homeschool students at Masters Books Academy. So again, John Stamper, welcome to the Counter Revolution podcast.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Great to be here.
Yes, sir. And like I said, I have been binging State of State Schools, which I find very important as a podcast because which I'm going to ask you kind of some of the your latest news, but you give kind of basically some news and things that's happening in the state schools or government schools, kind of popularly, but I think wrongly named public schools
Right.
because they may have been public school at some point, and I see why they want to continue to call them public school, but they're very much government controlled benefit schools. Um, so I want to say this: I read your book, Conflicted. Both I read both books. Thanks to Miss Jennifer. I was I had seen you on the one podcast Schoolhouse Rock.
Yeah. With Yvette.
Yes, I
Yeah.
had seen you on Schoolhouse Rocked. Um, but I see a lot of people on there. When I
Sure.
started getting interested in this subject, that's one of the podcasts that I came across. And so I see a lot of people, though, a lot of great people, and I've benefited a lot from that podcast over the years. But then, as I started my podcast, I'm talking to different people. Miss Jennifer reached out to me and said, "Hey, this guy, he's awesome. You gotta talk to him." And so that's how I got to read. She sent me your book, your first book. I got to read it. I was like, man, this is crazy. Then I don't know if you remember, but different things happened. I wasn't able to have you on, but now here
Yeah.
we are. Thank God, this is timely. 2025. You are the first person I'm interviewing for this year. So
All right.
let's do this thing. So conflicted. You were a public school teacher for how long?
13 years. Two of those years I was in a private school, but for 11 of those 13 I was in a public school. And I had moved around quite a bit. I've been in five or six different school systems, states. My last year of teaching was with Chicago Public Schools, just for that 1 year.
So you started as a private school?
My very first year was public, and then my second year was private. My third year was private. After that, years 4 through 13, they were all public. Most of them
Okay.
at one school system in Indiana.
Okay. So how was that in Indiana? Because I'm interested in private school as well, but I'm trying to compare primarily public schools. How was it in Indiana?
Sure. So, I mean, most of my career, my first 12 years, really, I loved teaching. I loved teaching and coaching. It suited me. I loved going to work every day. I was getting good at it. I took, pride in my craft. I saw it. I kind of approached every day as an opportunity, to be a Christian example. I was saved when I was 18, freshman year of college, and I was already studying to become a teacher. So I kind of, from that point on, I was like, this could be my ministry. I felt I had the skill set for it, I had the temperament for it, and what an opportunity to be in front of young people, even colleagues, parents. You're just around people all day. So many chances to, just be a witness for Christ. So I viewed it as such for most of my career. And I loved it, but just like most other jobs, for example, my dad was an iron worker. When I was growing up, he was an iron worker. And everywhere he worked, it wasn't a godly situation. You got all kinds of people. You got atheists, you got some Christians, you got people. It's a rough situation. But so I kind of viewed teaching that way. I knew it wasn't a godly environment. I knew the public schools weren't like ordained by God. Like they weren't like wonderful. They weren't preaching the gospel in any public school. But I really never experienced the level of indoctrination like I did in 2020 with Chicago public schools. Yeah, there was plenty of psychology, and really, I mean, it's always been there, but I just was not really aware of it my whole career through psychology and all these different programs. So I really didn't understand it until recently.
Yeah.
Just the last few years, I started to understand better, like, how the public schools began, the history of them. And, you know, so while I was teaching and while I loved it and while I'm a Christian, I was participating in things I didn't really understand that were not God. I just didn't understand the depths of it at the time. So that's really was the motivation in my first book was, to provide information to parents, Christian parents, maybe who have their kids in public schools, even Christian teachers who were just like me, who mean well and they mean well. They love their profession and they care about kids but maybe they just don't understand what these things mean that are right in front of them every day. So that was kind of the motivation for my first book was really just provide information and kind of, warn people of what's coming down the pipeline.
Yeah. So the reason why I was starting with Indiana, I know that your book focuses on Chicago Public School,
Yeah.
but I just wanna, I guess, understand kind of your from like how you came about to end up in Chicago and how
Sure.
your eyes got open,
Yeah.
because the way I see it, eyes many of us were opened in 2020.
Yeah.
We kind of got pushed into a corner in 2020. But before that, most people didn't realize just how deceived we were
Yeah.
in many ways. So when you look back at Indiana, do you look back and say, "Man, I never really thought about it that way," but now it's like some of these things were there, I just didn't see them.
Absolutely. Yeah. They absolutely were there. I mean, things like social emotional learning. We've had staff meetings on that perhaps maybe my whole career, ever since I was out of college, 15 years, 13 years, whatever, things like that. And I just took it as, oh, it's psychology. They're just, it's, they're just trying to get kids to be nice and don't bully. It sounds so nice, right? Encouraging, empathy, understanding, respect, all these words that sound great. I don't want to be disrespectful. So if they're saying this is about respecting people, okay, it sounds good enough. So it was always there, but you don't understand, well, where did SEL come from? This is just one example.
Yeah.
And actually, there's Alex Newman wrote a great book recently and goes into detail about SEL indoctrinating our children to death. But so that's one example. But I didn't care to look into it. I didn't care who founded it. I didn't care anything about it. I just kind of in one ear and out the other, and I just went about my job. But like you mentioned, just in the last few years, it's like my eyes were just totally opened. And it's like, man, I've been participating in these things that had I known more about them, I would not have agreed with. I would not have gone through with it. So I'm just like, I don't want to, be blind to those things anymore. And now that I'm a father, it's like it's taken on a whole nother meaning. Now I'm concerned not just with other people's children, but my own child. So it's just important things, and it's just hard staying on top of everything when you're working, you're married, you have kids, you got responsibilities, you got bills, you got this, that, and the other. Who has time to sit down and research the history of all these policies coming in? It's a lot of work, but it's important work. And I think we're seeing more and more that it's when it all boils down to it's spiritual warfare. When we zoom out of the thing, we zoom out a little bit. We're talking about spiritual warfare. We're talking about things that are anti-God, anti-Christianity, openly. And when you're sending your kids to that kind of environment, you're playing Russian roulette, with their values, their salvation, and eternity's on the line in the big picture. So that's important.
Yeah. So what did you teach in public school? What was your area?
I taught a lot. I taught a lot of different things. I've taught every grade level, K-12. I've taught all the core subjects, math, spelling, history, science. Most of my time was as a PE teacher. I didn't go to school to be a PE teacher initially. I went to be an elementary education teacher, so like K through 5, but I had an endorsement on my degree for PE, and that suited me. I grew up loving sports, playing sports. I was always involved in coaching and things like that. Even in college, I volunteered or whatever. So teaching and coaching just suited me. And I spent most of my career as a PE teacher, coached a number of different sports too. So that's what I loved, and that's what I worked hard at.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get to Chicago, let me tell you a little bit of my kind of genesis to this point. I was always politically kind of aware. 2016 came. I was a lot more vocal. I became a lot more vigilant and vocal. So by the time 2020 comes, most people around me already know that John is into that kind of stuff. During that year, 2020 to 2021, I started to notice something weird. How many of us were able to comply with these ridiculous requests, kind of almost like at a snap of a finger. We just all were basically at the mercy of the government. And then I started to notice, the people on the streets holding signs, right? And it's not, at first, it wasn't that they were holding signs. It was, to me, what killed me the most, it was the lack of critical thinking. Because a lot of these articles that were causing problems, a lot of these news articles, because the media on TV, they were off completely. But when you read like a New York Times article, for example, yes, the title was totally deceptive. But if you read after 3 paragraphs, they had the information there, right? They told you, look, the cops only killed but a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. But most people didn't read that far. They only read the first paragraph, and that was enough for them to go and hold up a sign. So it was kind of weird to me. And you said spiritual warfare, but I was like, there gotta be something else. They had to be able to do this to these many people. How did they do it? So this is how, as I was pondering, thinking, questioning, I came across Alex Newman, and Alex Newman, Samuel Blumenfeld, and all these people.
Yeah.
These are the people that opened my eyes as to what the problem was. It's the whole thing about public education basically opened up to me in a way that it had never. I knew public education was messed up because I'm messed up. I'm a product of public education, but I never realized just to what degree the intentionality of the dumbing down. There's somebody
Yeah.
that wrote a book about the dumbing down of America or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I get here. It's 2020. Basically, 2020 caused me to stop and ask deep questions like, how did they do this? I saw some videos about students during school hours organizing and walking out of school to go and hold up signs,
Yeah.
right? I read the Black Lives Matter, their kind of positions, and I couldn't believe Christians. I did a video which brought me a lot of problems, by the way. Telling Christians, my Facebook friends, please don't support Black Lives Matter. It's not what you think it is,
Yeah.
right? And I got a lot of flack, but I was like, it's there. Why can't you guys read it, right? And then I don't know if you remember or if you ever seen this in the Museum of the Smithsonian, the museum.
Smithsonian.
Yeah, they released these points
Yeah, I know.
about. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had them screenshotted somewhere. I did a video
Yeah.
about them, and I was reading them. I'm like, wait, critical thinking is racist?
Yeah.
Are you serious? Right? So
Yeah.
my eyes were open. I knew there was something else, and I'm glad to talk to you because I think your book elaborates a little more on this. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there so you know kind of where I'm coming from. So then you end up in Chicago, a public school system. You went there as a PE teacher.
Right. Yeah. So you might wonder, why would I leave Indiana to go to Chicago public schools? Um, so my wife and I got married in 2018. At that time, she was living in Chicago. She works downtown in the city, and I was still in Indiana. But the commute uh, from where I was working in Indiana was like 40 minutes from Chicago, so it was a doable commute. I did that for a couple years, but then in 2020, when we had all the COVID shutdowns, my school in Indiana closed March 13th of 2020 and didn't reopen for the rest of that year. So that fall, we decided to move to a different place. We were to move out of our apartment building because the restrictions were just ridiculous. Like, we couldn't one person in the lobby at a time, and the outdoor spaces were closed. So we were like, we got to get out of this apartment. So we moved further north in Chicago, which meant I could no longer commute to that job in Indiana. So I looked for jobs all over the city, public schools, private schools, Christian schools, took interviews, and I ended up accepting a job with Chicago Public Schools at one of the schools downtown. It was a Montessori school, so it kind of like it had a lot of similarities with how I grew up. Like, they had chickens, at the school, and my family raised chickens when I was a kid. So it was like things like that seemed to fit. So I took that job for 1 year in the fall of 2020, and we started the year remote, virtual. So I had never even met my students. I met like 2 or 3 of my colleagues just at a park just to get to know each other. Anyway, I didn't meet a student until, 6 months later into 2021. So that, if you kind of go back in time with me, that's where we were. Most schools in the country were fully remote or like a hybrid. But during the fall of that year, and you can stop me at any point, but during the fall of that school year, 2020, I had to undergo mandatory teacher training, which I've done every year of my teaching career, a couple times a year. And it's usually like we'll get up to speed on some new law that was passed, or, safety in the workplace, just kind of general. Even if you're not a teacher, most businesses have something like that. So I was like, okay, no big deal. Here we go. And you click the slides. But the whole training, and you would have thought, first time being a remote teacher, I've never done this. Most teachers haven't done this. You would think that some sort of training on how to manage a classroom virtually, that we would have been trained on that, but it wasn't. It was the whole training was supporting transgender students, using preferred pronouns, parental secrecy policies, all of these things that became big news, in the following year in 2021 is when we had all those school board protests,
Hmm.
and it got real out of hand because parents started to see what was going on. So when I'm going through this, I'm like, I was really caught off guard because I was not expecting it, even though it was Chicago Public Schools and whatever reputation they had. Um, I'd been through trainings before, but not like this. And it was so clear in your face. And it was, this is the truth. These are our policies. This is what we're implementing now. If I have a kindergarten boy walk into my class and he says he's a girl, I have to affirm that child, which is lying to that child. And that's just how it's going to be. So as a Christian, I had a number of conflicts on this training. And that was really what was a turning point for me, where I kind of had to make a decision on what I was going to do. You could go the way of, I'm an employee, I'm just going to do my job, I'll do what my employer says, or I'm not going to do what they say because it violates my conscience. It goes against what the word of God says and my beliefs.
Yeah.
but then that creates a whole nother set of problems. So it was a very difficult situation. And I think a lot of people can relate to that because I certainly am not the only one who experienced something like that.
Yeah, so that's one of the books, one of the chapters that gripped me the most. Is kind of chapter 4, your personal experience in staff training, and these trainings were mandatory. So if you opt out of that, what happens?
I mean, I don't even think I've never even heard of an option to opt out. It's mandatory.
Yeah,
That's like our work for the day. We have to click through it and submit at the end. Otherwise, there could be some sort of reprimand or, I don't know exactly, but I've never even heard of opting out of a mandatory training.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and mandatory.
Yeah.
You probably end up losing your job.
Yeah.
So you said here in your book that for the first time in your life, you're teaching physical education over a computer to hundreds of K through 8 students.
That's right.
And instead of being provided with resources you needed to do your job, the school board decided to train all teachers on far left political ideology. And you were expected to integrate these theories into your class, as a Christian. So when I was reading this, I was like, surely you have other Christians in that environment with you that that they're Christians, right?
I would assume so. But again, remember that we were remote for until probably March of that year, March or so, which is a couple months left in the school year. So again, I hadn't met the majority of my colleagues. I'd never met them
Oh, okay.
except through maybe like a virtual staff meeting, but so it was difficult to even talk to people about this. Most of them had never met me, their new teacher, new colleague in the building. So I really never got a chance to know people even on that level of getting to know them one on one, except for maybe a small handful of like there was another PE teacher that we kind of had to collaborate on some things, but I wouldn't know if they were, or I don't know if they were Christians or not.
Yeah. Um I can't even imagine. At some point I was reading the stuff that you wrote and I was like, man, how can anybody stay in this environment? What are the common justifications do you get on why Christians remain in these environments?
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons. I think in my experience, the number one reason why I remained a public school teacher for so long is ignorance. I didn't know. I didn't care to research or read or study. I was just kind of focused on my job and doing better in my classroom, really just focused on what I was doing. So just not knowing really what's going on, what's kind of behind the curtain, which is part of that book. And then, like I talked about, I had that difficult decision going one way or another, maybe compromising, maybe kind of seeing a Christian would be a good employee, so I'm going to follow my boss's instructions. That's me being a good Christian. Maybe I'm going to compromise here and there. This is my workplace, this is not my personal life. So there might be some sort of compromise, and you know every person's situation is different, so we could probably throw a few more ideas out there, but and I'm not trying to like condemn anyone or bring shame to anybody. I know I know Christians in my family, friends, they're Christians and they're in the public schools. So if that's where God has them, then I pray for them. I encourage them to follow God's will for their life. But so I don't mean to like shame or blame anybody or condemn anyone, for being in the public schools, but I certainly don't recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's a mission field and Christians are missionaries.
Yeah.
So I personally do not condemn um a full grown adult knowing
Yeah.
what they're getting into who go into the public school and
Yeah.
say, here I am, Lord, use me.
Yeah.
Or who hears based on their relationship with God, hey, I think God wants me to go there. It seems to be
Yeah.
a need. Um, my question was more when people get to where you were and they're conflicted because that's the whole point here. They're
Right.
conflicted, but their values are clearly
Yeah.
being undermined. But we all have experiences where we start making justifications. I have a family to feed, and all these things that I've heard of over the years. I just wanted to see kind of your experience. But let me ask you this question. I saw the things you had endured with critical race theory, gender ideology, and all these things that you're not only told as fact, even though it's just a
Yeah.
theory, but you are also being told, hey, we're not just telling you, we're not trying to basically indoctrinate you. We actually want you to go as our mouthpiece,
Yeah.
as our messenger to the kids. You know, at some point in your book, you say these messages are damaging to children on both sides, the oppressor oppressed categorization, especially when they are taught to children as fact, as not theory. In your kind of view or experience, are some of these kids pushing back, or what's going on there?
In my experience, I saw no pushback. In fact, I saw the opposite. I saw the results of the indoctrination on these kids. But two things. I want to go back to how it damages kids on both sides. I want to talk
Hmm.
about that, and then, but I'll talk about this thing first. So, for example, at the end of that school year, June of 2021, Chicago schools go until the end of June. June is Pride Month, right? So all over the school, there were pride flags, papers in the hall. We were back in school at this time, the last couple months of the year. So we're back in person. And students could sign up in the hallway to be an LGBTQ ally. This is kindergarten through eighth grade. We all shared one building. And this is not, no parents are signing off on this. So a 5-year-old could walk up and say, I want to be an LGBTQ ally. And they write their name and they get bracelets and they're making bracelets. I had a student, a second or third grade student, come in and bringing me pictures of rainbows and love is love and this and that. I walk into school one day and on my desk is a pride flag that I was supposed to hang on my door. It wasn't, there was no instruction. It was there. All the teachers in the building did it. I didn't do it, but it's just like expected. So that was kind of the reality I was walking into. Now, the other thing about how it damages children on both sides, this kind of goes back to critical race theory. In my training, we had a section of the training that dealt with intersecting identities. Intersecting identities. You may have heard of like intersectionality. So it showed a graphic, and there are like different versions of this graphic, but they're all basically the same. It was about it identified quote unquote privileged identities and marginalized identities. So it's basically the oppressor versus the oppressed, the privileged versus the marginalized. Marginalized. This is like Marxism 101. So it was two circles. There's an outer circle and an inner circle on this graphic. The outer circle were all of the privileged identities. Things like if you're white, you're privileged. If you're a man, you're privileged. If you're a Christian, you're privileged. If you speak English, own a home. If you're able bodied, all privileged. And then the marginalized were anything that's not those. So, right off the bat, in terms of classmates, you have a white classmate, a black classmate. This is Chicago, very diverse population. You have everybody. So how can I implement this graphic, this training into my classroom and not make people into enemies? You're the privileged one, you're the marginalized one. It automatically puts you against each other. It's oppressor versus oppressed. And not even children, but colleagues, right? Parents of these students. So what it does, it just divides people right off the bat, right? So that's how it damages not just children, but the colleagues, the parents. Um, and I eventually wrote that to the school board about what their training was going to result in, which kind of sparked me to leave. So Um, it's
So
serious. It
what?
has consequences.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine because if you tell people that they are oppressors at very young age,
Yeah,
um, the I guess the it's a demonic thing where in my view, in my experience, as I've looked into these things, it's supposed to induce a kind of guilt right? Where, and a lot of these kids that are committing suicide or that are basically taking on these identities that is a kind of a denial of who God created them to be. It's all in a way caused by these things. And I think when you really think about it, the cultural Marxists, this is how they get their revolution. When you get enough people that powerless and just guilty, right? And when you get enough people on the other side also paralyzed because they've been conditioned to believe they're victims, they need to depend on the government because they can't do for themselves. You end up with people that depend on the government on both sides, and that, I think that's the goal. When you're going through these trainings, um, you're being told you have to implement this. You're a Christian. You decide, okay, I'm not going to do this. What is their excuse for the? Are they trying to improve outcomes? Are they trying to improve the environment? Like, what's their reasoning for this?
Well, I mean, to give them the benefit of the doubt, which maybe I shouldn't, but it's DEI, it's diversity, equity, inclusion. It's all wrapped up with a nice, pretty bow. Diversity is our strength, and equity, inclusion. Who doesn't want inclusion? I'm not going to exclude you from my class. Not that I ever have. I've never in my life hung a sign that says so and so is not welcome here. So everyone is welcome in my class. So why is that even anyway? So again, the language, and that's the common theme you're going to find through a lot of all these policies throughout history is the manipulation of language. So like define your terms is a good question to ask. What do you mean by that? Because when you hear things like justice or social justice, it doesn't agree with the concept of biblical justice or even the definition of justice. So like define the terms. That's an important thing to do, and you'll find that they have very different meanings. It's not what you think it is. Pull back the curtain, dig a little deeper, and you'll find the truth. That was my experience.
Yeah, I'll tell you. Anytime someone says social justice, I cringe.
Yeah,
Sometimes they mean well, especially when they're
yeah.
Christians. Without understanding how we these terms came to be, most people think social justice and biblical justice are interchangeable. I guess when the meaning behind what the person is using the word for is important, but for me, it just reinforces the people on the other side who've stolen the words. They've changed the words and they don't mean what you mean. So you think you're talking the same language, which is why I prefer the term biblical justice because biblical is in the word, and so most Christians would understand what I mean. I mean justice that is biblical, not social, because there's two different meanings at best of what that means. But for the most part, for us conservative, historical, Christians, traditional Christians, biblical means biblical. I was looking at some of these reports from. There's a report from the Pew Research, uh, which says that the vast majority of teachers, 82% of teachers, say that the overall state of public K through 12 education has gotten worse in the last 5 years, and only 5% say it's gotten better. 11% say it's gotten neither better nor worse. Now, this is a 2024 report on the state of teachers' views on the state
Yeah.
of public K through 12 education. 82% of them think that it's gotten worse. And the last 5 years, that includes when you were experiencing. Do you think this critical race theory and gender ideology would add to why these teachers feel that way?
Well, yeah, 100%. Absolutely. For the reasons we just talked about. And again, where are the academics? None of these things are academic based. I mean, my personal view was when I was teaching is teachers are doing more than they've ever done. They're working so hard. The teachers that I taught with my throughout my career, they work so hard. They're doing more than they've ever done, and the results just keep going down, 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 down. Why is that? And that's a loaded question. It's a big question. But what I've come to understand better is that the public school system in America is not broken. It's functioning the way it's supposed to function. And you got to go back and look at the history of the public school system. Who were the major influencers? Why were they designing the system this way? It's meant to function this way. So the system isn't broken. It's a well-oiled machine. And that should tell you something about the system. Now, that's different than, to me, that's different. I'm not talking about teachers here. I'm not talking about individual teachers because I know a lot of good teachers. Okay. I know a lot of Christian teachers, even non Christian teachers, but they mean well in their job. They want to do what a teacher is supposed to do, teach children, reading, writing, how to do math, etc. But I look at like say a Christian teacher, for example, in a public school system. It's like you're in Babylon. It's like you're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego living in Babylon. You can do that, and there are biblical accounts of that. That may be what God has called you to, but that's not easy. That's hard. And if that's the case for those individuals, we should pray for them and encourage them to stand on God's word. So, I have nothing against teachers, but it's that system that is not going to yield good results.
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on because that's basically why one of my reasoning to start this podcast, which I hope will grow into a ministry beyond just online podcast, because I don't think Christians should be sending their children to public school because the public school system is designed to strip away um, it's designed to undermine education in general, but Christianity in particular.
Yeah,
So,
and they don't hide that. The training I mentioned, the intersecting identities, specifically labeled Christians as privileged, and that's not a nice statement. You're meant There's guilt attached to that. You're the privileged identity. You're responsible for the harms, the oppression. So they don't paint Christianity in a good light. It's the opposite.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. The critical race theory, Marxism is
Yeah.
atheist,
Yeah.
so it's anti-Christian, and it sees Christian as it's basically that's what's in their way.
Hmm.
That's what's been holding them back from their desired revolution, but they genuinely see Christianity as oppressive,
Hmm.
which is understandable. If someone is homosexual, we think it's sinful. We do not think that's a good thing. So we are at odds. We believe that with all of our hearts, many of us Christians, and they believe their theories
Yeah.
with all of their hearts.
That's right.
So we cannot coexist. One has to uh go away or stay quiet. Can you explain what a gender unicorn is?
Yeah. The gender unicorn was part of that same teacher training. It was presented on a slide or two, and it was designed specifically for kindergarten students. I was to talk about this graphic with my kindergarten students. So it's a graphic, the gender unicorn, which was used in a lot of schools across the country. You can find it online easily. It looks like Barney, the cartoon character. It's like a purple unicorn. And there's a video attached to this training. It's like your students are going to love this character. It's so cute and cuddly. They're going to have fun with it. Show it to your kindergarten 5-year-old students. So what it does is it says it's a little graphic, and it says you can be a boy, you can be a girl, or you can be any other gender. Okay, you can be emotionally attracted to a boy, a girl, or any other gender. So from 5 years old, first step to a public school at 5 years old, kindergarten, this is what you're exposed to. At the very least, it's confusing. Boy, girl, other genders. What are other genders? Well, let me tell you about the other genders. So from day one, These kids are just being bombarded with it. And even if you're an eighth grader, right? My school taught eighth grade students 13, 14 years old, a little older, as mature as a 13, 14-year-old can be. They're still not in control. They're in that classroom all day, every day. The teachers have the authority, the principals have the authority. They can't go to the bathroom without permission. You know what I'm saying? So they're under the authority of these adults who are being compelled to implement these policies. You talked about public schools can be a battlefield. If you're a full grown adult, you're a mature Christian, and that's where God has called you, you're equipped to go into battle, by all means go. But for children, I've heard someone use this. Would you send a 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old into a battle, into war, having no training? I wouldn't. So that's kind of my position on should Christians send their kids to public schools is personally, I wouldn't for that reason. But as you mature, you get, I don't know, maybe you're 16, 17, 18 years old. You're a mature Christian. You've maybe gone through things in life, that might be different, but these little kids don't stand a chance.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, there's all these things that's in the public schools that, many people remove their children because of that. And
Yeah.
that's great. But for me, it's a philosophical question, right? Because as I've been digging into this, I tend to go down rabbit holes when I go
Yeah.
when I focus. And I've just come to conclude that, and this is, I believe, a big miss among Christians here in America for the last 150 years, is we have forgotten two things. One, that there's such a thing as a Christian philosophy of education and other philosophies of education, like a progressive philosophy of education, and other ones that are less scary in how they sound, but they're all ultimately anti Christian when they don't have the Bible at the center, right? When God is not viewed, when there is no understanding that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom,
Hmm.
right? Then that's going to deviate eventually. And that's how public school started. School started with this country being, like, I'm talking about the way we have it today, basically was generated by people who would have considered themselves Christians and who, yes, they were Unitarians, so they did not hold to Orthodox Christianity, like guys like, John Owen and, man, what's his first name?
Horseman.
Horace Mann. They were Unitarian, but they would have easily considered themselves Christians. But they used whatever argument they used. They were convincing a majority Christian community here in America to send their kids to them to educate. And eventually, public education becomes what it is today. But it wasn't always like this. You hear stories about people who tell you at some point you had catechisms in schools, you had the Bible, you had 10 commandments listed everywhere, you had Bible studies and all this before. But once you removed that core understanding of what knowledge is, you were going to deviate eventually. As you said earlier, the public school is not doing some it's doing exactly what was intended. It was intended to take
Yeah.
us where we are today.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I was going to say is, education is discipleship. And that's one thing that Christians don't understand, that when we send our kids to public school, the public school system is very much teaching the kids in the way they should go. It's
Yeah.
training them in the way they should go. It's training them to go in the other direction
Yep.
from what God would want them to go. So it's a discipleship program no matter what.
That's right.
And so these are the two things that I think, once people missed this, once we separated formal education from discipleship, it's like, what Nancy Percy calls the kind of two-tier system, the secular sacred split, right? The discipleship, right? as we call it in the church, is in the sacred tier category, and then this the secular is here. That's where education is. But that's a splitting of truth. That, I don't know if you ever read the book Total Truth by Nancy Percy. Basically, she's outlining how the truth is being split into two, and how Christians need to get back to a total truth, a truth that is complete. You then talked about in chapter 5 your
Well,
conflict.
if I
Yeah.
could, real quick before you move on,
Yep.
just there were two things I thought of while you were talking. You kind of got into a little bit of the kind of the history of the public school system. You mentioned Horace Mann, Robert Owen, Alex Newman does great teaching on this. He's got a 5-minute video where he talks about the history of the public school system. So for anyone listening, I would encourage you Google that video. I share it on my website under the resources tab, if that helps. But that answers a lot of questions, and that kind of turns on a light bulb for me anyway. It did. And then you also talked about training them in the way they should go. How we learned that in the Bible, right? But the world also does that same thing, and the public school system knows that they got to get to the kids and train them in their way. There's a verse in the Bible. I can't remember the book offhand. It says, the student is not above the teacher, but every student, when they are perfectly trained, will be like their teacher. So if you're a parent, you got to ask, who's training and teaching my kids? Because the student's going to be like their teacher. That's what the Bible says. So things to think about. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, another thing, another one, my favorite verse that I've been quoting a lot as of late. I forgot. Is it Matthew 15? One of them. It's in Matthew, but it's Jesus basically saying, "You're either with me or you're against me. You're either gathering with me or you're scattering." And I always tell people the public school is not with Jesus. According to Jesus, there's no such thing as neutrality. If you're not with
Right.
him, you're automatically against him. The public school system, which parents are supposed to partner with for the upbringing, really, and the equipping of their children, is anti Jesus.
That's right.
And as you said, they're pretty open about it.
They would claim to be neutral, but
Yeah,
they're not.
well, there's no such thing as
No,
neutrality. They can
no.
claim neutral they want. There's no such thing as neutrality. Okay. Now, you said that you went to Chicago public school, which is a big school district. You said some numbers that I thought were insane here in chapter
Yes.
5.
Third largest school district in the country. School
Yeah.
system. Yeah.
Yeah, you said it's the third largest school system, but you said that the mayor appoints the school
Yeah.
board?
Yeah. Yes. Until this year, they just started holding elections, but for a limited number of spots. But for its entire existence, Chicago Public Schools has had an appointed school board, right? Not elected, like most small towns across the country have school board elections
Huh?
where people vote. That was not the case for Chicago Public Schools. And I didn't know that until, after the fact. But that's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. You also said that Chicago has not had a Republican mayor in over 90 years.
Yeah. And the mayor is ultimately the one responsible for those appointments.
Yeah.
So consider that.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. All right, John. You're saying all these things, but this was in Chicago. Come on, I'm in Lancaster, York County. It's pretty conservative, red here. I'm sure, and actually, I know because some of them are my friends. The public school employees here are Christians, so surely the kids are safe here. No, like they're not in that environment.
Well, I don't want to make blanket statements. You know, the good thing is that we have different states, and states can run somewhat differently than others. But ultimately, when we're talking about public schools and public funding, which is regulated by state governments or federal government, there's really only so much that the local school can do. So if they don't follow state mandates or federal mandates, they're not going to get that funding, right? So it really ultimately comes down to who's paying for it, right? Public funds, your tax dollars. And you might think, oh, my tax dollars, I should have a say. But once those tax dollars are issued out by the government, it's not your money anymore. So it kind of, the big picture is it's still Babylon. It's controlled by the federal government or state governments, and the common thread is funding, right? And if you go back and you look at the history of the public school system, you know how it was founded, how it was started. You had Robert Owen, the English manufacturer, then Horace Mann, and then it kind of went on to John Dewey. And Horace Mann and John Dewey are revered in public education. And you look at the history of what they did. But so to get down into the little details, even in my immediate family, my sister and her kids, they live in a very small town in Indiana. And even in their little school in Indiana, they have the transgender policies in their school, right? And you can see that across the country, like Utah. Yeah, I believe it's Utah. Maybe it's Idaho. I think it's Idaho, actually. The most conservative state in the country based on voting, right? The most conservative state. It was something like a 10,000% increase among teenage girls identifying as LGBTQ in the
Mm.
most conservative state in the country. It's an astronomical increase. Maybe that's not all attributed to public schools, but you know, most of those kids in that state are going to a public school. It's a major, major factor in, the minds and the hearts of children. And like I talk about in my podcast weekly, I kind of talk about stories all over the country. You see these things popping up all over the country, big schools, small schools. So I don't want to make a blanket statement about every single teacher, every single school, because they're all somewhat different, but they're all in the system. They're all in Babylon. And you can take a stand in Babylon. You can take a stand on your Christian values, but that's a difficult stand to take. So it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a famous quote by Charles Francis Porter. He was a humanist. I believe he was a contemporary of John Dewey. And he said that education is the most powerful ally of humanism, and that every public school is a school of humanism. And he goes to say, what can the theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teachings?
That's right. Yeah, John Dewey himself, yeah, he called himself a humanist and he said that was his religion. Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of goes back to, we mentioned it earlier, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, 180 days a year. That's a lot of time under that influence.
16,000, I think. Um, Israel Wayne said 16,000 hours when it's all said and done. Um, Now, as you were talking about, being a Christian in the public school. Well, actually, let me move on from that. Can you talk to me about teachers unions? Because I did a whole thing on teachers unions, the NEA and the AFT. Is it? First, were you part of a teachers union, or what's your kind of experience with them?
No, I wasn't. Not even in my job in Indiana. But talking about Chicago specifically, I did not join the Chicago Teachers Union. And I was told that I was the only teacher in my building not in the union. Because, union representatives will approach all new employees. Do you want to join the union? Here are the benefits. And if you say, let me think about it, they'll follow up with you over and over. But I didn't join largely because of in that the summer of 2020, right? A very chaotic summer across the country. Chicago Teachers Union at that time, their Twitter page started making a number of wild tweets, and you can probably find those on the internet. For example, it was the push to reopen schools is rooted in racism and sexism and misogyny. This was the Chicago Teachers Union posting this. And then I remember there was a guillotine placed outside of Jeff Bezos' house, a guillotine. and the Chicago Teachers Union retweeted it and said they're in support of this. It's like, what is the Chicago Teachers Union? Should we be focused on representing the teachers or education? So I did not want to be a part of that. That was just my personal opinion on that. I was like, I didn't want to give my money to that group. I wasn't in line with their views or their values. So I was not a part of it. Most of the teachers that I did eventually talk to said they didn't even know they had a choice. They said, I thought it was just obligatory. You became a teacher, you joined the union. So that's kind of how rare it was to not be in the teachers union.
Yeah. It sounds to me like in some cases, the teachers union, and I'm sure had you been there longer, the environment becomes such that if you don't join them, then you kind of become somewhat of an enemy, if you will.
Yeah, that's the fear. That's the fear. I never felt like because I didn't join the union, I never felt differently. I don't think I was treated differently. But that's the fear. I want to be liked by my colleagues. I don't want to be an outsider. I don't want to be ostracized or anything like that. But I also am responsible for myself and my actions and what I do and the groups that I contribute to. So I have to factor that in as well. But yeah, so certainly there is a pressure. You do feel pressured. And that's not specific to me. I'm sure other people have gone through similar situations.
I saw some reports. In fact, Prager, you did a big expose on the teachers unions a few, like maybe 2 3 years ago, where some of their claims was that in fact they attribute the decline in the quality of teachers, or maybe even accountability on bad teachers, on the grip that the teachers union has on the system. What's your view on that?
I mean, I personally, I think every job should be merit based. Like every other profession. There's going to be people who are better at their job than others. Some people just won't be a good fit for a certain job, no matter how bad they want that job. They're just not good at it. That's just the reality of things. There are plenty of jobs that I wouldn't be very good at. So there are better teachers than others. It's hard for a teacher. Teachers really don't get fired for doing a poor job. Really, you only hear of teachers getting fired for misconduct, things like that, stealing money or, some sexual allegation. That's really all you ever hear of teachers getting fired. It's not for poor performance. So I'm in favor of, a merit-based system. If you're not a good teacher, you shouldn't be a teacher.
Yeah. Yeah, the Pew Research number here, I think it's indicative of, I believe, the grip that the teachers union have on the public school system. Or maybe what's your thoughts on this? It says a majority of public high school teachers, 58%, identify or lean towards the Democratic Party, and about 35% identify or lean towards the GOP. Why do you think that is?
I think that's kind of the end product. Again, it kind of goes back to the history of the public school system and you know their motivations and what they're trying to accomplish. And so, as a Christian, and this kind of goes way back to Robert Owen, who kind of has is credited a little bit with our current public school system and the Prussian model. But he tried. Robert Owen, again, this is like the 1700s, I believe, 18, yeah, 1700. He was a utopian, right?
Yes.
And he actually came to America, to Indiana, my home state, and he set up a commune to try to realize his dreams of utopia in New Harmony, Indiana. And it failed after 2 years.
New Harmony.
New Harmony, right? But Owen didn't blame his system. He didn't blame his beliefs. He blamed the liberty-minded Americans,
Yes.
Christian values, because the two systems weren't cohesive. They didn't jive. So he didn't blame himself. He blamed those liberty-minded people who love their freedom and their liberty and their, Christianity, their Bible, because they wouldn't want to. Those liberty-minded people didn't want to be part of a commune. They didn't want to be communists. So So it kind of, when you learn about that history, it starts to make more sense currently. So, it's just the value system of the public school system. It's a one size fits all education. It's elements of communism run throughout, like the value system and what their end goals are. Robert Owen, for example, his goal wasn't to educate people, it was to make them good workers for his factories, just to teach them just enough to be good workers for his factory. And then, that became the Prussian model in Germany. And then Horace Mann visited and learned about that Prussian model and integrated some of that here in America, in Massachusetts. We had the first law passed, I believe 1852 in Massachusetts, was compulsory attendance. You got that. That's from the Prussian model of education, and that was the first law ever passed concerning education in America. So, you know, there's a common thread throughout, and you start to learn these things, and it starts to make more sense of. So it's not just about of why are we here right now. It's a long path to get here, um, and it's worth digging into. And again, we both have mentioned Alex Newman. He does great teaching on this. His new book is awesome, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. He talks about this in depth. So I would recommend that book.
Yeah, I had Alex on. He actually was my first ever guest on this podcast to talk
Wow.
about his book, um, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death.
You set the bar high with him, man. Yeah, Alex is awesome.
Yeah, that's my guy. In fact,
Yeah.
we were planning on doing another episode because I have to dig into the UN and UNESCO and what
Yeah.
they're doing to basically bring about global communism.
Yeah.
So you decided you were gonna leave the public school after agonizing through it, after going through what you needed to go through. You said you reached out to the school board. How
Right.
was that?
Right. So, yeah, like you mentioned, that training was in the fall, like November, December, something like that of 2020. And I kind of wrestled with it for a couple months into January or February, March, not knowing what to do, praying about it, talking about it with my wife. And that was the conflict. Do I just leave my career? You know, I worked so hard, but I can't do this thing that they're telling me to do. So I wrote all my thoughts in a document, which really is what's in the book, Conflicted. And at that time, we weren't in person yet. It was kind of right before we went back in person. And I wrote, so I didn't have anything to do in person. It had to be through their online portal. If you have like any sort of complaint or grievance or whatever, you got to go through the protocol and do it all online because it's a huge district. So I filed a formal complaint directly to the school board over this training and over the materials, talking about like what we've been talking about here, how these things are going to divide, they're going to cause damage, all these things. And I submitted that to the school board. It was a number of pages, and they replied soon after. To their credit, they did reply, and they said, "We're not going to investigate this," and that was it.
Yeah,
So at that point, it was like, okay, now what do I do? And there's a number of ways you could have gone. And actually, in my newest book, I talk about another PE teacher in California, Jessica Tapia, who faced a very similar situation in 2023. And she went a different route. You know, I believe that's where God led her. So for me, ultimately, after months of prayer and agonizing over it, ultimately I felt that it was like when Lot had to flee Sodom before the city consumed him, right? The iniquities of the city consumed him.
yeah,
And that's ultimately how I felt.
yeah,
I spoke my piece to the school board, seeing if they would do anything about it. And then I felt like I needed to get out of that situation, like just like God sent Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's why I resigned at the end of that school year, which was difficult, but I felt great peace about it. I felt like God was leading me to do that because it's interesting looking back on it, how God provides, and God knows what's coming in the future that we have no idea what's coming.
yeah,
And it's just his goodness. It's his grace. He's so good. In 2020, when I was still teaching in Indiana before COVID, or no, at the very beginning of COVID, I still had my Indiana job. I wasn't with Chicago yet. Schools shut down in March. I was like, well, I got 2 months of school left. How am I going to teach my students? So I made a website, and I created my own homeschool curriculum. As a former homeschooler, I felt very comfortable doing this. And it was like a K through 8, I think, curriculum. And I turned it into a business and it became profitable of how you can still develop skills and stay fit at home during COVID. The whole country was in that situation. That was 2020. And I had this online homeschool curriculum. So then fast forward, I resigned from Chicago public schools. And that's when I reached out to Masterbooks, Randy Pratt at Masterbooks, a homeschool curriculum provider, Christian curriculum. I emailed them and I said, "Hey, I have this online curriculum. You guys don't. Would you like to work together?" And they said, "Yeah." So I've created courses through them. But God was kind of opening that door before I had any idea what was coming.
Yeah.
So looking back on that, it's just God was so good, and He's such a caring God, and He's got it all under control. So my obligation is just stay in touch with Him and try to be obedient and go where He leads. And that sounds easy, but it can be very difficult.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean that was definitely helpful. I mean, there's so much we can talk about with regards to the public school system. I rant about this a lot. So just before we move on, can you take 2 minutes, a minute or two, and can you speak to someone that might listen to this message that has their children in public school, Christians with children in public school?
Yeah, I mean, I would just encourage them if they're Christians, excuse me. If they're Christians, of course, read the Bible daily, pray, begin with prayer, ask God to lead you and guide you. But in the Bible, I believe you'll see that, you know, parents are given the duty of bringing up their children in the way they should go, always teaching them to remember God's goodness, remember God's wonderful works. We see that in the Old Testament and the New Testament, always reminding them of who God is, what He's done, and instructing their children in the way they should go. And it's clear, as we mentioned earlier, that no student is above their teacher, and they'll be when they're perfectly trained, they'll be like their teacher. So that should cause us to question, who are my children learning under? Of course, I'm their parent. I have influence over them, but 16,000 hours, as you mentioned, who are they sitting under for those 16,000 hours of their education? So I would begin there. Okay. Think on those things and then begin to look at the details of these school policies that we're talking about, DEI, these transgender policies, and because they're always going to be wrapped up in, compassion and empathy and respect. But really, it's just forcing you to comply with ideologies that are contrary to the word of God. So, and, you're going to get labeled, you're going to get name called most likely, you're going to be you know, a hater or uneducated or, you're privileged, etc. And that's going to come. That's not going to be easy. So it's going to take, courage. It's going to take a conviction, and you have to, hold tight to the Lord and trust Him, because that's, all that you have to stand on is knowing God's character, knowing what He's done in the past, what His word says. He's faithful. He's going to accomplish it. So putting your faith in, trust in Christ and God for your future, for your children, living out what the Bible actually says to do. That would be my encouragement. I mean, that's kind of a number of things, but that's what I would say.
Yeah. And to the teacher in the public school system, Christian teachers, what would be your words of wisdom?
Yeah, I would say, read the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were believers living in Babylon, and they had to sit under, Nebuchadnezzar's rule and his evil decree of bowing and worshiping the golden idol. And they only bowed to God Almighty. They wouldn't bow to a man-made idol. And the consequence was the fiery furnace. And so this is all a picture of what we can kind of go through in our lives here today is, you know, if the public school is Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar, are the powers that be, and the edict to bow and worship are these policies and school rules that are contrary to the word of God. What are you going to do when you're faced with them? Are you going to stand like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or will you bow out of peer pressure, self-preservation? These are hard. These are high stakes things. These are not easy. I don't mean to make light of them. So it's just, be ready, but be bold and courageous in the Lord, So, those men were put in that situation. It's like Esther for such a time as this. So things are not going to be easy if you're a Christian teacher in a public school. Eventually you're going to face a conflict of values, you know, a spiritual conflict.
Well, thank you, my brother. I mean, that is, I think it's awesome to have someone like you that's willing and courageous and bold enough to step up and do something that many unfortunately are not willing to do. Because in my experience, there are many in the system who they end up living it, but they live it with their head down. They just, they just go and quietly. But I'm always encouraged by Christians who, go to the rooftops and say, "Hey guys, watch out. There's something out there." Because I imagine this is very helpful, this book, and I strongly recommend this book to parents because and other public school teachers and administrators, because this is helpful. This will encourage others to maybe not do exactly the same, but to have some courage in these times that we're in. So, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all that, John. I appreciate it. You know what? If I could just one more thing before we leave, when you talked about my advice to parents, read the chapter in that book about my parents. I think it's called Phil Donahue and the Atheists. When I was going through my conflict with Chicago public schools, I was constantly reminded of what my parents did 30 years prior in the early 90s and why they made the decision to homeschool my siblings and me. So the example that my parents lived out in front of us stuck with me even to this day. But, I was in my mid 30s at that time, and I was still learning from my parents' example when I was 5 and 6 years old. So for parents, the word of God is true. That what you do is going to impact your children. What you teach them, when you train them up in the way they should go, they won't depart from it. That was true in my life. And I'm still learning from the example my parents set 30 years ago. So what you do really, really matters. And it's going to impact your kids for the rest of their lives. So yeah, it could be difficult, but God is so good and he's so faithful that it's gonna be worth it in the end. And we've talked about heavy things here tonight, John. And as Christians, we should be joyful, we should be happy. Um, and there's so much to be thankful for because God is so good, he's so caring. Like I talked about him, preparing things for me. And it was hard to leave teaching, but I don't regret it. I love what I'm doing right now. So I thank God for it. So God's a good God. You can trust him.
Well, thank you.